So now I want to talk you briefly through the participants and data collection graphic organizer, pilot study versus dissertation, which is available to you in our Google folder. So I'm going to just go through an example because I think that's the best way to do this. This will help you organize the write-up of your methods. And there's a column for both the dissertation and the pilot study because as you think about the data you want to collect for your pilot study, you will probably be already thinking about your dissertation. So for example, if you're doing a case study for your dissertation, you may be thinking about 5 or 8 people you need to interview, documents you need to collect, maybe like a quick questionnaire you want to do, like all kinds of things to really get a big picture of this case. But for your pilot study, you may end up doing just 2 interviews or just 1 interview and maybe a bit of collection of documents. So remember that for your pilot study, you only need to have 2 pieces of data. But again, separate this out so that you really have a sense of the difference. Now, your dissertation does not need to be totally fleshed out at this point. You can use this again later. Anytime you think of something like, oh, I should be thinking about this, make a note of it, because when you go to write up your methods for your Qual 2, which is also happening during this class, but later, you're going to need this column for the dissertation. This is really important, and it will become important right away, right? Like during this class, just more towards the end of it. And then more towards the beginning of class, we're going to be using what's in the pilot study column, all right? So the first thing asks, what type of data will you collect for each group? Describe the instrument. And of course, you need to put your research question here first. Katie, this example, she did not do it. And the reason why is your research question should guide everything. And I think it's so important to have that in front of you as you're thinking about this. So in her pilot study, she says, okay, it's going to be a survey. It'll be survey data from a mashup of 2 surveys. And that is totally fine for your pilot study if you're doing a survey. It's just to try to put together a survey and gather 10 or so respondents. But for her dissertation, because it's mixed methods, notice that there's the survey, but there's also interview. And she says semi-structured interview questions that I will create based on survey results. So she's already thinking ahead to the mixed methods design is that first the survey, then she's going to create the interview questions out of the survey. So it's a sequential mixed methods. So then, well, what's the population? In her case, families of students with an IEP, these are the case, and then, and so that's the families part, and then the case managers of in special education in the Bay Area. So it's a geographically bounded population of interest. But for her pilot study, it's going to be, whoever she can get a hold of, which is totally fine, all right? People from class, anyone who will help you out, right? Because you're trying things out in your pilot study. Then I ask, are there any hierarchical sets? And the reason I ask this is that when you're selecting a sample, particularly for your dissertation, you may select 2 classes, for example, within 1 school. Or you may end up, in her case, she could have decided to select families that are families that particular case managers are working with. That would be a nested sample. She did not, right? So the families were not associated with the case managers. So you need to think about that in terms of, for example, if you're doing an interview study, are all the interviews going to be from 1 school, 2 schools, a particular district? And of course, it's perfectly fine if they're not. But if they are, you will need to make note of it, that you start building out a nested sample or a sample that is bounded in some way. Now, characteristics that are important to your study become very important when you get into sample, and the sampling video will, talks about this, of course. She writes, of course, the case manager versus the family because she's surveying and interviewing both. And then she talks about ethnicity and income level, years of experience of the case managers, etc. Now, this is based on her literature review. And later, she ended up actually changing the significant characteristics that she would look for. So you can see in the pilot study, in terms of the next line, how many total do you want to collect? This is really important that you are very, very clear on this, that you give us numbers, not a few, etc. These are, and you know, you may end up getting something different than this. This is your goal. This is your aspiration, all right? So she says 10 respondents from each category on the survey. That was her goal for the pilot study, which is totally fine. You may have, 2 interviewees of a particular category, or one from one category, one from another. Or maybe it's, 30 students responding to a prompt, and then one interview of one teacher, if you're doing like action research in a classroom. Then in our dissertation though, right, this is different. She wants 100 teachers, 100 case managers, and hopefully 50 families who respond to her survey. Now, this is very important. This is where you start getting into the characteristics. For the interview, she says, I will select based on the characteristics above once, it says they have completed the survey. So she's going to have case managers complete the survey. Then she's going to select 5 of them based on their years of experience. And she's going to select 5 families based on the range of ethnicity. So you can see here, it asks, how will you target data collection for a similar or varied sample? So do you want the sample to be varied across a particular characteristic? Like you want a variety of different types of ethnicities, for example? Or do you want the sample to be similar, like one kind of ethnicity, and vary it in a different way? So maybe you want your whole sample to be Latinx students who are low income, but you want to bifurcate them and have half of your sample be folks who made the transition from high school to community college, and half to be folks who did not make that transition. Usually you only want to vary in one characteristic, and you want to hold the rest constant, because that allows you in your final results to really highlight what's going on for that one characteristic. So in the case of her case managers, she is going to be able to really have something. She wants a range of experience so that she can understand what's going on across experience. But what she ended up doing is saying, I want to select folks who feel like they serve their families well and folks who feel like they don't, that becomes the most important characteristic. And everything else is either held similar or it's held varied, right? Like you want a range, and then you want to make sure you're bifurcated in two ways. So I don't know if that makes sense, but think about that as you think about your sample. Now, what kind of sampling strategy? This is where the video on sampling really helps. For her pilot study, she's using a convenience sample, and that is totally okay. For her dissertation, she's using what I would say are 3 sampling strategies. So she's purposeful, and most of you are going to be having a purposeful sample, right? A certain kind of people for your interview study, certain, important roles within a case study, right? Like maybe you want the leader, or maybe you want people participating in a certain way in your case study to interview. That's a purposeful sampling. In her case, it's also bounded geographically by the Bay Area, and to some extent, she's using Snowball because she's going out through her networks. All right. And then how you'll find the people and how will you do the actual data collection. So this all essentially, the great part about this graphic organizer is you literally take every sentence in here and it just becomes the paragraphs of your methods in these sections. And of course, I will give you feedback and help you with this, but this is a good example to start with.